Well, good morning, friends, and welcome to my channel. I am Crystal, and this is Homemaking on the Homestead. And today, I'm going to take you along with me as I do some winter canning, is what I like to call it. I have been working on this for the last week or two, and I have 3 different canning recipes to show you, and I think you're going to like them. I will say that I use my Presto digital canner for all of them, and I just absolutely love this canner. If you're not familiar with it, I have talked about it a few different times on my channel, so I'm not going to go into a big review on it, but it is a great canner, especially if you are a beginner. It takes a lot of the fear and uncertainty and maybe stress out of a big size canner, and it just sits right on your countertop. It does not can as much as a big stovetop type canner does, but it does a really nice job. You can also use it as a boiling water bath, which I have done that to make jam, which I showed in a previous video. But today, these 3 recipes are what I consider pretty much whole meals. I like to do both, do ingredient canning, so I have a little bit of this and a little bit of that to grab from the shelves if I want to put together soup or casserole. But I also like the concept of having entire meals or almost entire meals ready to go on the shelf. And so I'm going to show you that, especially 2 of them. I will show you all the way complete to when we ate them. With one of the recipes, I started out with 6 pounds of hamburgers, so I will show you how I turn that into 8 pints of chili, along with a meatloaf and one other meal starter to put into my freezer. So I feel really good about all the accomplishments I made. I have lots of food right now sitting on my shelves to take us into 2024 and more plans to can more things here in the next few weeks. But for right now, let's get going, and I'm going to show you all the wonderful foods that I have canned in the last couple of weeks. All right, let's go. For this first recipe, I soaked my 3 cups of red beans overnight and drained them the next morning. I then got my 6 pounds of hamburger out and went ahead and measured out 3 pounds, which is what the recipe called for. I set that aside to cook it and then measured out, divided up the rest of that hamburger for other uses that I had planned. After the beans have soaked, you also then need to cook them or boil them for another half hour. So I was preparing to do that. And yes, the recipe calls for adding a little bit of salt to it, which I think is always important. After that, it was time to get my hamburger cooking. So I started that and let those beans cook for 30 minutes. Cooked up my hamburger. When it was partially cooked, I went ahead and added some onions. And I added the minimum amount of seasonings. The recipe kind of gives you a range. I like to err on the side of not enough. That way I can always adjust it later. Once the beans were cooked, I did save some of the bean broth just in case I would need to thin out the chili, which I did. I used this brand, Cento brand tomatoes for the first time, and I have to say that I absolutely love them. I had no idea that some tomatoes have a better flavor than others, and these were absolutely amazing. I felt like the chili was too thick, and so I did add some of that reserved bean broth. I then put it into my jars. I wasn't thinking straight, and I thought that it would hold 9 jars, so I ended up filling up 9 jars, but it was okay because I ended up using that plus the chili that I had left over for our dinner that night. But anyway, after the jars were all filled, I went ahead and put the lids and the rings on, and I got that going in the canner. All the recipes and or links to the recipes you will find below in the description box, which will give you all the measurements and times and all those types of things. I did have chili left over, and so I decided we would have that for dinner. You can see there, that's what I had left over, plus the 1 extra jar that I had to put in there. I added more water to it because the beans were not completely cooked, and I wanted to make sure that those beans got nicely cooked. Now with the rest of the hamburger that I had, I turned 2 pounds of it into a meatloaf. and for the freezer. And I don't have a specific recipe. I just kind of do my own thing whenever I make meatloaf. If I'm doing meal prepping like this, I just like to take advantage of what I had. Like I said, it was a 6-pound package of hamburger that I had gotten from Costco. So I figured, well, let's get more food into the freezer. And then I took the last pound, little over a pound, and I turned that into taco meat, which I also ended up just putting into a Ziploc bag and putting that into the freezer. Once my chili was done and the canner had cooled completely, I removed all the jars and they all turned out wonderful. All of them sealed and are now currently sitting on my shelf. For dinner that night, of course, we tested it out and it tasted great, and I decided to make some cornbread. I was using a recipe from this Keeping Good Company cookbook, which I have talked about, and it turned out really good. And I can share more about that in a future video. But there was my finished dinner: chili, salad, cornbread. It was absolutely delicious. We enjoyed all of it. The next day, I washed all my jars because there was a little bit of siphoning, and they are now sitting on my shelf ready to enjoy. This recipe was using up my leftover ham that I had and juices there that I had from our Christmas dinner. And I didn't have, a huge amount, but I had enough that I felt like I could do something with it. So I started by taking all those juices and the bone and a little bit of the meat and went ahead to make broth. I also added extra water so that I would have plenty of broth and a little bit of onion in there. So I let that cook for about an hour, and while that was cooking, I took 2 cups of navy beans and put them on to cook. I let these cook for about an hour and a half. I wanted to make sure that the beans had expanded well so that there wasn't a whole lot of expansion in the jar during the canning process. Once the beans were cooking, I set about to cut up the rest of the meat that I had, as well as take the meat off the bone after the broth had been made. I also added the other ingredients, which were the carrot and I think maybe a couple carrots and some onion to that. Now I felt like I was ready to assemble my soup into my jars. Basically what I did at this point was just start to layer everything. I took a layer of the drained navy beans, and then I put some ham in there. Since I wasn't following a recipe, I just wanted to make sure that I could divide everything between the jars, not run out of ingredients, and not overfill the jars. Once I saw what I had after I had done the first round of layering, I decided to go ahead and add the rest of the beans that I had cooked and the rest of the ham that I had left over. At that point, it was time to take the broth that I had and divide that between the jars. I knew I did not have enough broth to fill each jar, so I wanted to divide that and then just put boiling water to bring them into a 1-inch headspace. And after cleaning the tops of the jars with a little bit of water and vinegar, I put the rings and the lids on, and I put them into the canner. I set my canner to can for 90 minutes. I have canned a lot of ham over the years in soups and with beans and things like that. Typically, it is considered something you should not can. So therefore, it is probably one of those rebel canning things. So I just will give that out there as a bit of information, and you do what you feel is best for your family. But after 90 minutes, I had some beautiful looking navy bean and ham soup. The recipe for this beef stroganoff actually makes 2 quart jars. So I tripled the recipe. The recipe calls for 2 pounds of beef chuck roast, and I ended up with a 6-pound package there and tripled it. By the time I had cut off all the fat and all that, I think I really had probably getting closer to maybe 5.5 pounds. And I was able to get 5 jars out of that. As you can see, I am measuring out all the spices that are required. I was just trying to get everything done in advance. After I measured out all the spices, I then started slicing up my mushrooms. And then I started cubing up my pot roast. Like I said, there was a lot of fat on it. Of course, chuck roasts do have that, generally speaking, but there really was quite a bit of fat, and I cut all that off as much as at least I was able to, and then put everything into a large bowl. The recipe called for not only the beef and the mushrooms, but some Worcestershire sauce and some tomato paste. And so I just kind of put that in there along with the spices, and I started out by trying to, gently mix things in with a big spoon, and I found it was really getting difficult to mix everything up and make sure all the meat was coated with the tomato and the spices. So eventually I just got my hands in there, my clean hands, and mixed it up. Then it was time to pack it into the jars. So this is a raw pack recipe, and I just started filling my jars up. You don't want to overstuff your jars when you do it, but you do want to make sure you get them as full as you can. And after doing all that, like I said, I was able to fill all 5 jars and used all of it up. I then covered all of the jars, filled all the jars with beef broth that I had made from some Better Than Bouillon beef broth. And again, you just bring all the liquid up to 1-inch headspace. I used my trusty little plastic knife there to debubble and add a little bit more broth as needed. I then wiped the rims down with some vinegar and water and applied my lids and rings. At that point, it was time to turn on the canner and set it up for 90 minutes, which was according to the recipe, and start the process. After the jars had canned for their 90 minutes, and the canner had cooled down, I was able to remove them from the canner. I was very disappointed though, because I had one jar that didn't seal. But since I had never tried this recipe before, I felt like it was a good opportunity to try it and see what we thought. I basically poured the contents into a saucepan or a stock pot there. I added a couple tablespoons of flour to that and let that come to a boil and cook for a few minutes to give it time to thicken up and cook any of the flour taste out of it. While that was doing its thing, I cooked up some noodles. Technically, you're supposed to use egg noodles. I did not have any. I put them on my grocery list right away, and I had some linguine noodles that we used instead. After this was done, the recipe isn't clear as to how much sour cream to add. So as you can see, I just put a couple big scoops of it into there, stirred it up, and that actually was just perfect. I will have to say that we absolutely loved this. The flavors were delicious, well seasoned, and I have no complaints. I'm very happy to have the jars of it on the shelf, and probably will consider making some more of it just to have on hand, because like I said, we really, really enjoyed it. All right, well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you give me a thumbs up on this video. It really helps my channel. Also, if you have any questions about anything that I canned or talked about today, make sure you ask me down in the comments. And if you've been doing any canning lately, let me know what kind of stuff you've been canning. I hope you guys have an awesome, blessed day and a great week ahead. And I will see you all in my next video. Bye-bye.